Boldwood presents Arsenic in Ascot, written by Kelly Oliver and read by Willow Nash. Chapter 1. The Telegram. I knew it would happen sooner or later. In 1 week, I'd gone from fearless lady spy to glorified gopher. Well, perhaps not that fearless, and not that glorified either. I reshuffled the already neatly stacked file folders and arranged them to exactly parallel to the corner of my desk. I may be a mere file clerk, but mine was the tidiest desk in the old Admiralty. This wasn't saying much, given the manly state of disorder in most of the War Office, especially Room 40, with its rows of drafting tables all overflowing with papers, telegrams and folders. According to my dearly departed father, outward turmoil concealed inner peace. If so, the men in Room 40 had the souls of monks. Thankfully, the converse wasn't true, or my mind would be a battlefield. I patted the top of the stack. No, a well-ordered desk was a sign of a well-ordered mind. A wooden screen kept my little corner separated from the pandemonium on the other side, where the codebreakers worked on deciphering German telegrams and secret messages. The room was long and narrow, like the barrel of a rifle. Standing at one end, you could barely see out the windows at the other. At the far end of the room, a few desks held teletype machines. Most of those were operated by women working alone. But the male codebreakers worked in packs like wolves. One such pack, 3 of the best codebreakers in the business, huddled around a drafting table just on the other side of my screen. They howled whenever they cracked a German code. A lot of crucial deciphering of enemy telegrams and such happened in Room 40, just not by me. My boss, Captain Reginald Blinker Hall, had assured me this wasn't a demotion. I was just back where I belonged. And not because I'd failed on my last mission, or because of my penchant for silly disguises, as he called them. To be fair, I hadn't had the opportunity to wear a disguise on my last assignment, unfortunately. As Captain Hall informed me, my singular mission, besides filing and fetching tea, was to follow the notorious German spy and South African huntsman, Frederick Fredericks, expert in war propaganda and agent provocateur. Over the last 7 months, I'd followed him across the globe, from Paris to Cairo and back again, as he disposed of double agents and undermined the British war efforts. Always one step ahead of me, he taunted, teased and shamelessly flirted. Cheeky cad. Captain Hall, but I wasn't so sure. Heat spread up my neck as I remembered our one secret kiss in the mountains of northern Italy. Not a real kiss, mind you. Merely an espionage ruse to avoid detection. We'd almost been caught following a couple of socialists and had to stage a kiss. When I closed my eyes, I could almost conjure his sandalwood scent. Get a grip, Fiona. He's your enemy, for goodness sake. Trouble was, no one knew where to find the bounder. He'd vanished without a trace. His trail had gone cold, and as a result, so had my spying activities. I gathered the stack of folders and went to the filing cabinet. Balancing the stack on one forearm, I opened the top drawer. A familiar smell hit my nose, the earthy scent of aging paper, laced with stale cigar smoke and a hint of lingering futility. At least I could console myself that I'd developed the world's best filing system.
Miss Figg, be a good girl and bring us some fresh tea.
The booming voice coming from the other side of the screen was unmistakably that of Mr. Dilwyn Dilly Knox, former papyrologist at King's College, Cambridge, known as much for his dalliances as his code-breaking. Moving my fingers along the tops of the folders in the drawer, one by one, I slid the new ones into their proper places and pretended I hadn't heard Mr. Knox.
Did you hear me, Fiona?
He bellowed so loud, everyone in the building had heard him. I stacked the remaining folders on top of the filing cabinet and poked my head around the screen. You rang, sir?
A spot of fresh tea, if you please.
His thick lips parted into a lascivious smile.
Mine has gone cold.
Cold tea, cold trails. Cold careers. What hadn't gone cold? I stepped in front of the divider. Yes, sir. I bobbed a quick curtsy. Very well, sir. He laughed and waved me along. I'd been right about one thing. Without Fredericks, I was nothing but ordinary, boring Fiona Figg, head file clerk and 25-year-old war widow on her way to spinsterhood. Truth be told, my husband had divorced me before he was killed, which made me neither a widow nor a spinster, but something far worse, a divorcee. I sauntered to the kitchenette, making a show of dragging my feet and taking my time. Making tea when I should be trailing spies. Sigh. How I miss the adventure already.
Shake your tail feathers, Miss Figg,
Mr. Knox called after me.
I'm dry as an ancient Egyptian.
My flat feet. Oh, go stick your head in a bucket, I said under my breath.
What's that, Miss Figg?
I turned and flashed a fake smile. He was peering over the top of his eyeglasses at me. Oh, with a bit of luck, I rounded the corner into the kitchenette. Will be ready in 2 shakes.
It had better be.
He sighed.
Monday mornings are cursed.
The kitchenette was a narrow rectangle with yellowing wallpaper, chipped floor tiles and a stained counter sporting a bachelor's stove. As usual, the small sink was overflowing with dirty dishes. Really, couldn't these brilliant men clean up after themselves? How hard was it to wipe out a cup? I huffed as I stood staring at the mess. Too busy with national secrets to drop an empty biscuit box into the rubbish bin. Shaking my head, I put on the kettle and set to work washing the dishes while I waited for the water to boil. The kettle whistled, and I rushed to remove it lest it disturb the code breakers. They could be a cranky bunch. I whirled hot water around in a stained porcelain teapot that had obviously seen better days, and then emptied it in the newly cleaned sink. I poured a goodly amount of black tea from a paper bag into the pot and followed with boiling water. After letting it steep into a nice strong brew, I loaded a tray with a little jug of milk and several cups. Anyone wanting a slice of lemon was out of luck. I hadn't seen a lemon since the bloody war began almost 4 years ago. Thanks to the defence of the realm, cake and pastry order, however, tea was declared a weapon of war and thus essential to our troops' success. It certainly was essential to my success. As my grandmother always said, with a good strong cuppa, you can get through anything.
I say.
A familiar voice came from the doorway.
Here, old thing, there you are.
Captain Clifford Douglas, good friend, compulsory chaperone, and blabbermouth. With his receding hairline and long face, he looked rather like a horse, a well-groomed horse. The wet dog at his feet shook itself, spraying me with mist. Almost anything. The little beast, Poppy the Pekingese, belonged to my erstwhile espionage partner, Kitty Lane. The girl had stayed behind on our last mission to tie up loose ends. Unlike me, she had not been recalled from the field.
Perfect timing.
Grinning, Clifford eyed the tea tray. Why the War Office thought I needed a chaperone was beyond me. Still, he was as loyal as a hound. Be a lamb and carry this out, will you? I handed him the tray. He stared at me like I'd asked him to walk naked across Whitehall. I pushed it at him, and reluctantly he obliged. If I could deliver tea, so could he. After all, he had been grounded too. The only place he'd chaperoned me in the last week had been to the canteen for lunch. While he'd enjoyed toad in the hole and suet pudding and nattered on about god-awful hunting adventures, I'd nibbled on buttered toast and sipped tea. We delivered the tea to Mr. Knox's workstation, where 3 codebreakers stood, heads together, examining a telegram.
I say.
Clifford shoved a pile of papers out of the way and sat the tray on the table.
Have you broken a code?
The men clammed up. Mr. Knox flipped over the telegram. Curses. If Clifford wasn't along, they might have given me a glimpse. I had helped solve the Zimmerman's telegram that got the Americans to join the war. I poured a splash of milk into each cup. The men could help themselves to the tea. I wasn't a servant. "Is it true you have a photographic memory, Miss Figg?" Mr. Nigel Gray slid a cup and saucer off the tray. The other men called him Dormouse, presumably because he was petite, with a pointed nose and sleepy eyes. The grandson of the 5th Lord Walsingham, he'd been a whiz at languages at Eton and was recruited by the head of cryptography.
"Let's see a demonstration, shall we?"
Mr. Knox chuckled, glancing around the mess of papers strewn across the table. He plucked one out and thrust it at me.
"Take a look and then we'll test you."
"I'm not a trained monkey at a circus." I put my hands on my hips. I wasn't about to humour him with a demonstration. Ridiculous man.
"I'll bet you can't do it,"
Mr. Knox said, a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. I scowled, determined not to be baited. He waved the sheet of paper under my nose.
"If you can reproduce this word for word, we'll let you see the latest telegram we intercepted."
He nodded to his pals.
"Right, lads?"
"Don't pester, Miss Figg." Mr. Montgomery came to my defence. With his pinched face and spectacles, Mr. William Montgomery still looked more like a preacher than a codebreaker. A Presbyterian minister and an expert translator of German theological texts before the war, now he was the head of cryptography. Too late. "You're on." I'd already snatched the paper from Mr. Knox's meaty paw. Good heavens. The document was in German. While my French was part, it was no use trying to read the bloody thing. I stared at it, forming a mental snapshot. That was the way my memory worked. I could commit any document to memory just by looking at it. It truly was as if my mind took a photograph, and later I could reproduce it in full even without comprehending one whit. Mr. Knox grabbed the paper out of my hand.
"You studied it long enough."
He slapped a fresh piece of paper onto the table and then pulled out a chair.
"Have a seat, Miss Figg. Let's see what you can do."
Smiling, he winked at the other men.
"Fiona has a brilliant memory."
Clifford removed a pencil from his breast pocket and handed it to me.
"The old bean can probably recreate every document in that bloody filing cabinet."
He pointed toward my workstation. I nodded. At least someone believed in me. "Tea, if you please." If I was putting on a show, I might as well get celebrity treatment. Clifford fetched a cup from the tray and sat it on the table next to the blank sheet of paper.
"Quit stalling, old bean."
Mr. Knox chuckled, causing his ample belly to shake.
"Worried you can't do it?"
Even Poppy, the little beast, looked up at me expectantly. Pencil in hand, I took a sip of tea and then began transcribing from memory. Once I started, I couldn't stop, lest the text unravel. I had to reproduce it all at once, as fast as I could, or the picture lingering before my mind might vanish. The document was in front of my mind's eye, just as it was before my physical eye only moments ago. But this version was ethereal and fragile, like the vapour floating up from my teacup. An automaton, without any idea of their meaning, I wrote out the German words.
"By God,"
Mr. Knox said.
"She's doing it." "I told you."
The way Clifford beamed, I wondered if he put a wager on me. "There." I shoved the paper at Mr. Knox. "Done."
"She showed you, Dilly,"
Mr. Gray tittered, his tone high-pitched and tinny.
"Good on you, Miss Figg."
Poppy barked in agreement. "What's that dog doing in here?" Mr. Montgomery's voice was stern.
"She's not just any dog."
Clifford scooped up the creature, cuddling her in his arms.
"She's Poppy the Pekingese, Britain's premier canine intelligence agent." "Enough horseplay. Get that dog out of here."
Mr. Montgomery scowled.
"We've got a war to win."
"The telegram." I wiggled my fingers at Mr. Knox. "I reproduced it. Now, You owe me a look at the latest intel. Mr. Montgomery's lips tightened into a thin line, but he didn't say anything. Of course, it wasn't cricket to allow a lowly file clerk to see classified documents, but Mr. Montgomery had always been one of my most ardent supporters. In fact, he'd recommended me for my first espionage assignment when that poor bloke fell and broke his leg on the way to Ravenswick Abbey. His bad break was my lucky one. Fortunately, the head of cryptology was too distracted by a dog in the office to worry about me.
Fair is fair,
Clifford said, pinching tobacco out of a pouch and poking it into his pipe. With a dramatic flair befitting a West End Shakespearean actor, Mr. Knox waved the telegram over his head and brought it down onto the table in front of me.
Have a go at it.
I snatched up the telegram. He poured himself a splash of milk and another cup of tea.
None of us can make head nor tail of the bugger.
As I read the telegram, an uncomfortable heat crept up my neck like a venomous spider. The proximity of the men was stifling. Give me space, if you please. I waved them away. Of course, none of them moved, except Mr. Montgomery, who sighed and went back to his own desk. Clifford peered over my shoulder, puffing away on his foul-smelling pipe. Poppy sat panting at his feet. Mr. Gray's beady dark eyes glowed with expectation. I could almost see his mousy nose twitching. Did he know I'd already decoded the wretched text? With an imperious look on his face, Mr. Dilly Knox put his hands in his pockets and leaned back into nothingness, as if sitting on a throne. The smirk on his round face made me wonder whether they were having me on. Was this some sort of joke? It was all too easy. I'd deciphered the telegram in a matter of minutes. Surely the men had too. My face burned, and I put a hand to my cheek. Oh, my word. A terrible thought took hold in my mind. I dropped the telegram and held my hand out in horror. My fingers trembled as I examined and then sniffed them. Could the notorious poisoner have laced the paper with some toxin absorbed through the skin? I glanced up at the men. If that were the case, at least one of them would be feeling the effects by now.
I say,
Clifford removed his pipe from his mouth.
Is something wrong, old girl?
Poppy tilted her head and squeaked.
Burn your fingers, Fiona.
Mr. Knox was clearly enjoying my distress.
You dropped it like a hot potato.
I glanced up at him and he winked at me. Did he know? Why had Fredericks resorted? I covered the telegram with one hand and placed the other across my racing heart. I don't feel at all well. It was true. My stomach roiled and I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. Either he was in grave danger or the bounder was taunting me.
Lady Troubles?
Mr. Knox asked with a snide grin. Why not? That would scare away the men. I nodded and pressed my palm against the rough paper. A strange bitterness rose in my throat. This telegram wasn't poisoned. Far worse. It was meant for me. And me alone. Chapter 2. The Invitation. Later that evening, alone in my flat, I paced the floor, wringing my hands and wondering what to do. Should I tell Mr. Knox that I'd decoded the telegram? It was so simple. Why hadn't the men figured it out? Maybe they had. Did they know it was meant for me? Although I hardly ever took tea in the evening, I needed to think. And what better way to clear one's head than a strong brew? My heels clacking on the wood floor, I headed for the kitchen. The echoes reminded me I was alone. Not just alone, lonely. Andrew and I had moved into the modest two-bedroom flat on Northwick Terrace just after we were married. We'd been deliriously happy. Before the war, before Nancy, the husband-stealing tart of a secretary, before he died in my arms at Charing Cross Hospital from mustard gas poisoning. The terrible memory sent me into a panic, as it always did. Breathe, Fiona. Just breathe. I leaned up against the wall to steady myself. When I'd regained my composure, I continued down the hallway toward the kitchen. Shuffling through the flat alone, only the sounds drifting up from the street for company, for the first time, I thought about moving. Or perhaps getting a cat, or a flatmate, or both. The advantage of both would be that the flatmate could mind the cat when I was gone on a mission, provided I ever got another assignment. Busying myself with the tea kettle, I tried to forget about Andrew. Of course, being back in this flat made it impossible. Everything here reminded me of the life we'd shared. Even the kitchen. He'd insisted on the newest appliances, the enamelled Smith and Phillips gas stove, the paraffin lamps from Liberty's, the telephone mounted on the wall that looked like a face smiling at me with its 2 bells for eyes, large protruding mouthpiece for nose, and long wooden lip. He'd said I deserved the best. That was before. The kitchen had been one of my favourite places to sit with a cup of tea and read the latest Sherlock Holmes stories in the Strand magazine. The black and white mosaic floor tiles and mint green wallpaper had made for a cheery retreat from the world. At least, they used to, before Andrew abandoned me. I took my steaming cuppa to the breakfast table and dropped into one of my mother's favourite painted chairs. I'd inherited the dining room set when she'd died, along with her unbridled ambition and unrealistic hopes for my future. If that telegram meant what I thought it did, I needed to get that cat and take in a boarder toot sweet, for I was about to get sacked. The telegram had been sent from the War Office, one of our own. Or at least it was typed on War Office letterhead. It read, 66, full stop, 13-1-385-1895, full stop, 85-12-16-13-5, full stop, 66, full stop. A simple numeric code, easy to decipher. Too easy. It used a plain 1 equals A cipher. Any schoolgirl could decrypt it. FF, ma chérie. Help me, FF. That was all it said. FF, ma chérie, help me, FF. FF, Fiona Figg, Frederick Fredericks. Yes, we shared initials. The scoundrel. He always insisted on calling me ma chérie, much to my consternation. Frederick Fredericks, asking me for help. Couldn't he have been more specific? Help him how? Help him where? Was he in trouble? Or was he once again trying to enlist me in his purported project of ending the war? No doubt by ensuring Germany's victory. I didn't trust him, and I wished he'd quit singling me out, although, if he hadn't, I'd never have got assignments taking me from Paris to Cairo. If it weren't for him, I'd never have left London, or this dreary little flat. In some ways, I owed Fredericks, the rotter. I should be grateful to him. FF, ma chérie. Help me. FF. I should take the telegram straight to Captain Hall. Trouble was, I had no idea where to find Fredericks or what he wanted. Was he setting a trap? Deuced vague trap. And why did he send his message via telegram, which he undoubtedly knew would be intercepted? How could he be sure I would see it? And didn't he care if everyone else saw it? So many unanswered questions. I aimed to find out where he was and what he was up to. No doubt no good. Should I tell Captain Hall or go it on my own? Should was probably not the right word. I knew I should tell Captain Hall. The question was, would I? I sipped my tea and pondered my future, selling chestnuts on the street corner. Conjuring the sweet burnt smell made my stomach growl. I fetched a packet of ginger biscuits from the cupboard. I'd been back over a week, and my cupboard and icebox were still empty. I didn't even have ice in the icebox, let alone milk or meat. I had yet to contact the ice girl and have her start up delivery again. My heart just wasn't in it. starting up my dreary, lonely life again. Biting into a stale biscuit, I realised I'd abandoned our flat after Andrew abandoned me. Now it was as filled with his absence as it was dust. I felt like I was sitting in a funeral home. Fiona, get a grip. There's a war on. Men are dying. You've got it good by comparison. I stood up and tugged on the bottom of my cardigan. Time to quit moping about and lay in some proper food. Of course, the standard for what counted as proper food had fallen drastically since war rationing. War bread made from whatever the baker could find lying around was ghastly, and we were lucky to get any meat or fresh vegetables. Perhaps I should reconsider Clifford's favourite toad-in-the-hole and suet pudding. At least it was filling. I stared into my empty cupboard. Tomorrow, after work, I'd go shopping. I took my tea and the rest of the pack of stale biscuits into the living room. I sat them on the sheet-covered table and began removing the sheets from the rest of the furniture. With every snap of the cotton sails, great clouds of dust filled the room. Coughing, I swore I'd pull myself together and put things in order. Halfway through, I gave up. I grabbed the biscuits and dropped into one of the crimson velvet chairs I'd inherited from my grandmother. When I'd visit the farm as a child, she'd never allowed me to sit in them. What would she think if she saw me now, munching crumbly biscuits in her precious chair? Planning my attack, I surveyed the room and nibbled. I'd piled a few sheets in the centre of the dusty Donegal carpet. A carpet brush was in order. The cupboard sported a thin film of grime, and the place needed a good dusting. The oak table and silver candelabra were covered in grey powder, and my grandfather's cook. All in all, the place required a thorough scrubbing. A new broom may sweep clean, but the old brush knows all the corners, my grandmother used to say. Munching the last biscuit, I sat watching the motes dance in the light and the crumbs fall to the floor, a sure sign I wasn't feeling quite myself. Tomorrow. I'd clean the house tomorrow. A rap on the door interrupted my melancholy reveries. Who could that be? I wasn't expecting any visitors. Maybe Clifford had dropped by to show me his latest story about our adventures. Yes, he fancied himself a regular Watson, reporting on our forays into crime-solving. By reporting, I meant exaggerating. When I opened the door, no one was there. I stuck my head out and glanced up and down the hallway. How strange. Whoever knocked had vanished into thin air. A neighbour's child playing a prank? I stepped back inside, shut the door and nearly stepped on an embossed card. I bent and picked it up. Heavy linen cardstock. Blank. I turned it over. Crikey. An invitation to a charity house party at Mentmore Castle this coming weekend. Addressed to Lady Tabitha Kentworthy. Obviously the delivery boy had got the wrong flat. Lady Tabitha Kentworthy. Surely there was no lady living in my modest building. I flipped it over again and stared down at the blank cardstock, as if invisible ink would show itself and reveal the sender or the true whereabouts of this Lady Tabitha Kentworthy. Turning the card over again, I reread the invitation. Lord Rosebrook and his daughter Lady Sybil request your presence at Mentmore Castle for the annual Rose Charity House Party to benefit the War Orphan Fund. This year's theme is Royal Ascot. 1st to the 4th of February 1918. RSVP, Lady Sybil Grant. The 1st of February. That's Friday. Today's Monday. Golly, only 4 days from now. Of course, I'd heard of Lord Rosebrook and his eccentric daughter. He'd been Prime Minister, after all. And I'd heard of Ascot, the horse race track. But who in blazes was Lady Tabitha Kentworthy, and why was her invitation to a charity weekend at Mentmore Castle under my door? I tapped the cardstock against my palm. Pacing around the living room, I stepped over dusty sheets and sneezed. First the coded telegram, and now a mysterious invitation. Both, no doubt, the handiwork of Frederick Fredericks. this time holding it up to the light, looking for secret signs or the scoundrel's panther insignia. Nothing. How odd. Usually Fredericks made a grand show of using his insignia seal. It was unlike him to lie low. For a spy, he always was remarkably visible, deploying the Edgar Allan Poe strategy of hiding in plain sight. That was, until now. Chapter 3. The Assignment. The next day at work, I couldn't stop fretting over the telegram. From Fredericks, obviously. Where was he, and why did he need my help? Sitting at my desk at the War Office, I pulled the house party invitation from my handbag and stared down at it. Also from Fredericks, no doubt. What was he up to? An uncanny sensation of being watched made me look up. Mr. Knox was peeking around the corner of the screen. "Don't lurk." I stuffed the invitation back into my handbag and pretended to straighten the pile of file folders on my desk. "Either come in or go away." Mr. Knox was the only one of the codebreakers who received such brusque treatment from me. And with good reason. He deserved it. The cad was always flirting with me and every other woman, and occasionally man, in sight.
"Did you crack that code?"
He sauntered over to my desk and sat on the edge. "Is that a trick question?" Any schoolboy could decode it. I narrowed my eyes. "Surely you figured out what it says?" And he was supposed to be one of the greatest cryptologists in Britain.
"Of course I know what it says."
He grinned like a hyena.
"But what does it mean?"
I shrugged. "Why ask me?"
"Know anyone with the initials FF?"
He winked. Was he toying with me? For all I knew, the whole thing was a rotten prank. I wouldn't put it past him. "I'm just a file clerk." I plucked a file from the top of my stack and delivered it to the filing cabinet. Not a code breaker.
"How far would you go for king and country, Fiona?"
He was leering at me again. Blasted man, using my Christian name and making lewd insinuations.
"Should I start calling you Matahari?"
He chuckled. That wasn't funny. Not in the least. I'd known Matahari. Poor woman. We'd become friends, of sorts. Of course, at the time, she thought I was a nun, offering absolution to her wretched soul. I'd watched the police execute her outside Paris. Dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. Poor woman. Her only crime was loving men. Perhaps a bit too much, and a few too many. Mr. Knox pulled a square of paper from his jacket pocket.
"You too shall be tested."
He handed me another telegram. 66, full stop. 131385 1895 1355 20 13 5 21 14 45 182972 514 20 15 13 15 18 18 15 23 1 20 14 15 15 14, full stop. 4 15 14 15 20 20 5 12 12 1 14 25 15 14 5 13 25 12 9 6 5 4 5 16 5 14 4 19 15 14 9 20, full stop. 66. I studied it. The same simple numeric code. Quickly, I did the transcription of numbers to letters.
"Love notes from your paramour?"
Mr. Knox leaned closer. I wish he'd get off my desk.
"Secret liaison, is it?"
He stabbed the telegram with a meaty finger. Of course he'd already decoded it, and he knew these coded messages were meant for me. Did anyone else know? I glanced up at him. Who else knows? A broad grin split his face.
"Why, everyone."
My cheeks burned.
"The code breakers, that is."
He grabbed the telegram from my desk.
"Not the upper brass. And Of course, not the secretarial staff.
That was a low blow, even for him. What exactly do they know? I steadied my voice.
Why, Fiona,
He smiled.
surely you deciphered it.
He waved the telegram, taunting me like a naughty schoolboy. Indeed I had. FF. Ma chérie, meet me under Big Ben tomorrow at noon. Tomorrow, Wednesday, at noon. As Mr. Knox pointed out, everyone knew what it said, but how many knew what it meant? Namely, that it was meant for me.
Are you going?
Mr. Knox stood up. I shrugged. Of course I was going. My chief assignment, other than filing and brewing tea, was trailing Frederick Fredericks to discover his latest plots to undermine Britain. I wasn't about to let him slip back into his hole.
To tell Captain Hall?
Mr. Knox stared at me with unblinking eyes. He was right, of course. I should tell Captain Hall. The telegrams were obviously from Frederick Fredericks. They were implicitly addressed to me. He claimed to need help and wanted me to meet him tomorrow, at noon, under the clock tower. And then there was that last line. Do not tell anyone my life depends on it. FF. Fredericks had forgotten rather important punctuation. What makes you think it's addressed to me? I avoided Mr. Knox's lecherous gaze and straightened the pencil cup on my desk.
Don't be coy.
He came around the desk and stood next to me, right next to me. The heat of his body made me break out in a cold sweat. He was making me deuced uncomfortable, invading my personal space. I leaned away from him. Do you think I should? I wasn't sure if I was asking whether to tell the captain or go meet Fredericks. No matter. I'd learned the best way to diffuse a cocky man was to ask his advice.
Personally,
he bent and whispered in my ear,
I never turn down a secret rendezvous.
The rascal put his hand on the back of my chair so that his fingertips touched my shoulder blade. I felt like an animal caught in a trap.
I'll tell you what we'll do.
His sour breath smelled of coffee laced with nicotine.
I'll go with you, and we'll keep it our little secret.
I twisted in my chair. It says, come alone. Fredericks always did have a flair for the dramatic. If his life was in danger, why come out of hiding to meet in front of one of the busiest spots in all of London? Then again, Fredericks was a master of disguise. He'd fooled me on more than one occasion, like when he posed as an Egyptian in Cairo, or a British officer in Italy. Excuse me? A girl guide appeared out of nowhere. The War Office had taken to hiring them to deliver messages and do odd jobs. They'd tried Boy Scouts, but boys had proven too unreliable, always horsing about and disrupting the coders. Mr. Knox took a step away from me and my desk. What must the girl think? Probably not the first inappropriate liaison she'd witnessed at the Old Admiralty. Not that my unwelcome encounter with Mr. Knox was a liaison. I'm looking for Miss Figg. Rosy cheeks and pigtails, she looked the perfect darling. You found her? I gave Mr. Knox the evil eye and then smiled up at the girl. A message from upstairs. Miss, I corrected. I took the card. She curtsied and disappeared. Oh dear. What now? Captain Hall needed to see me immediately. Why? Had he learned of the telegrams? Was he going to reprimand me? Did he have some papers that needed filing? Or perhaps he just fancied a cup of tea? I have to go. I tucked the note into the pocket of my bespoke skirt and pushed past Mr. Knox. Our little secret, I hissed on the way past, will have to wait. On my way up the dark wooden staircase, I thought about the telegrams. Why would Fredericks make these telegrams so easily accessible to everyone? Why would he use a primary school code? Why would he say to come alone when he had to know full well codebreakers in room 40 were reading his messages right along with me? Indeed, How did he know his messages would reach me at all? I was just a file clerk, if a darn good one. When I arrived at the first-floor landing, I stopped and gazed out the window. Late January in London was dreary. Today it was not cold enough to snow, but even through the window the damp penetrated my bones like a melancholy spirit. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my torso and continued on my way. Was Fredericks up to his usual tricks? Or was he truly in trouble? If his life was in danger, and the telegram was the only word he could get out of whatever jam he was in, then that would explain a lot. The War Office had a brochure on every situation. No doubt it had one on what to do when your arch-enemy summons you to Big Ben. I climbed the last flight of stairs and arrived at the captain's suite. Captain Blinker Hall had his living quarters in a well-appointed flat on the top floor of the Old Admiralty. His office was at the head of a long hallway. My low heels tapping across the bare floor, I covered most of the distance on tiptoe, as if I needed to sneak up on the boss. I quickened my pace. Having spent the last week filing papers and fetching tea, I was ready to get back out into the field, wherever that may be. Any place except cooped up behind a screen in room 40. I knocked and then entered Captain Hall's office suite. His secretary asked me to take a seat. I tucked my skirt under my thighs and sat in one of the high-backed leather chairs. The captain's office was far nicer than room 40. For one thing, there weren't rows of messy tables and dozens of men crammed into one room. As I waited, I studied the portrait on the wall. A distinguished-looking army officer wearing full regalia stared out of the painting. His expression of war took its toll on everyone, even the most committed, perhaps them especially. Something about the portrait reminded me of Archie. Perhaps it was the lock of chestnut hair peeking out from under his cap, or the melancholy smile playing on his full lips. Lieutenant Archie Summersby. I'd met him just over 6 months ago when I was volunteering at Charing Cross Hospital. We first kissed in Paris when I was dressed as Harold the Helpful Bellboy. Our second kiss in Vienna was a bit of a haze, all those gin-fizz cocktails. In Cairo, we stood under the mistletoe at Shepherd's Hotel. And then in the mountains of Italy, he'd proposed. I closed my eyes, recalling the scene. We were all alone in the hotel bar. He'd dropped to one knee, that irresistible lock of chestnut hair falling over his forehead, and had proposed.
I think you're a brick, and... Fiona, will you marry me?
He was holding my hand, and I felt him tremble, and then the crestfallen look on his face when I'd told him to ask me again after the war. I picked at imaginary lint on my skirt. Do I love him enough to marry him? With this bloody war on, would I ever get the opportunity to find out? Captain Hall will see you now. The secretary smiled and gestured for me to enter the interior office. I took a deep breath, held my head high, and strode into his office. Blinker Hall was a small man behind a large desk, dwarfed by the giant window directly behind him. He looked like a child playing at being in charge. He glanced up from his paperwork and nodded. Given the nervous fluttering of his eyelashes, his nickname was apt. You wanted to see me? I crossed the room and stood in front of his desk. He didn't invite me to sit.
I have an assignment for you.
His lashes fluttered.
Infiltrate the anti-vivisectionists and find out who is their mole at Porton Down. Someone out there is interfering with military research and feeding information to those darn animal defence people.
Yes, sir. Anti-vivisectionists. Good heavens. Infiltrate? Moles? I sucked in air and begged my face not to betray my excitement. Yes, sir. An undercover assignment. How thrilling. Who are the anti-vivisectionists? And what is Porton Down?
They're against vivisection.
He shuffled some papers on his desk. Right, I nodded. And what is that?
Using animals for medical research.
He looked up from his papers.
Specifically, experimenting on them, operating, cutting.
Yes, I see. I stopped him before he went into the gory details.
Your primary target is Emily Augusta Louise Lind of Hageby.
He opened a file folder. Target? Emily Augusta Louise Lind of Hageby. Quite a mouthful.
She is leading a campaign to stop our research operations at Portendown. I need to find out who there is feeding her top-secret information.
He read from a sheet of paper.
Lizzie Lind, a rabble-rousing Swedish immigrant who has taken it into her head to protect all of God's creatures.
He opened his arms and waved his hands over his desk, indicating the horizon.
We need animals for the war effort. Horses, dogs, goats, birds. Whatever will help us win this damn war.
His lashes fluttered.
She can save all the other animals to her heart's content, but not if they've been commissioned for military service.
Yes, sir. I wasn't entirely sure what he was telling me. We need more animals for the war? Animals in military service should not be saved? And what is Portendown?
Top-secret military research facility.
He tapped the stack of file folders.
I'll give you a file with the details on your mission. Bottom line, find the mole and possible saboteur.
Saboteur? Goodness, this was a serious assignment. I held my head up high. Yes, I was up to the task.
Someone is stealing animals.
He jabbed his finger at a file folder.
And find out what this Lind woman is up to.
He shook his head.
Appalling. She prefers animals to men.
Although I didn't see the appeal of animals myself, stinky creatures, I could understand the sentiment when it came to certain men. Still, after the horrors I'd witnessed while volunteering at Charing Cross Hospital, I couldn't countenance putting animals' lives before the lives of those poor...